The first heavy downpours of the new wet season had just set in. I was drenched and cold and miserable. I leaned out of the side door of the chopper and watched the trees flash past the runners of the Huey. We were at treetop level and hightailing it back to Nui Dat. Why was I miserable? My mate, my mentor, my friend, my teacher was dead. Maury Manton was our first killed in action. It was a mine on the outskirts of a VC camp. We had loaded his body, what was left of it, into a lowered stretcher cradle and added the pieces of legs and guts that we could find. Marsh, one of our scouts, had leg wounds. He was also winched up and taken off on the dust-off chopper. This is before the rain started. It was just after midday, and our oldest and most experienced NCO had stepped on a landmine. What I was really upset about was my own attitude and thoughts. I couldn't get it out of my head that it could have been me. No, it was more than that. I was not sorry for poor old Maury. I was leaping for joy, at least internally, that it wasn't me. It bothers me to this day that this was my overriding emotion as we flew back to safety. Selfish, self-centered, thanking the gods of war that it was not me who died. So much for honoring the fallen. Cliches galore bombard me. Old adages jump all over my mind. Tried and true is a phrase that is law and lore in the profession of infantry soldiering. So why was Maury waxing lyrical to any of us who would listen the other night in a mess over a few beers? He was worrying about our habit of infiltrating a VC camp in the same single file that we traveled in while on patrol that found the camp. It probably scared off any Charlie that might have been there, no matter how quiet we were in the approach, he had said, nodding his large head wisely. He may have been correct. We often found signs of very recent occupations. Fires not put out properly, food prepared but not finished, gear left scattered that Charlie would normally have taken. We learned a lot about how Charlie lived using this method. We argued. Yeah, but maybe we're letting them get away more often than he should, Maury had said, glaring at his dissenters. So here's a better plan that I've been thinking about, he said. How about when the Klee, his lead scout, spots the first signs of a camp, we bring up the section in the left or right flanking line so that we're ready for a camp-wide sweep when the contact is made, instead of a one-on-one fight with their tail-end Charlie as the rest of them bug out. Huh? What do you say? Yup, we said. Could be something in that. Knowing that changing an ingrained battle drill after discussion with just a few of us over a beer was mostly unlikely. 3 days later, we were back in the long green. The platoon stretched out in single file, 4 sections long. The only excitement so far had been a turn in the patrol that had me pause and watch in suspicion as the man in front of me suddenly veered hard, 45 degrees left. When I got to his turn point, I could see that he already turned 45 degrees right and was continuing in the same direction as our original line of march. I followed him. He then turned 45 degrees again, first to the right, then after about 6 to 7 paces, left again, we were back on the same line of march. And so was the patrol behind me. We were all achieving a square loop around a particular tree that now became obvious to me. I saw a thick brown-green vine that wound around the trunk of this tall tree. My eyes followed it upwards. It got thicker and thicker, and then started to writhe and move. The scouts in Maury's section in the patrol had cleverly moved our entire line of march smoothly and silently around the largest fucking python I had seen up until that point in my travels in Southeast Asia. It was a detour we all enjoyed and appreciated. This was especially appreciated by those of us who had been on an earlier patrol being led by a scout and section commander with a different sense of humor. On that occasion, the scout had spotted a tree seething with red ants, which attacked when threatened and sting like hell. Having got the two scouts and himself safely past this tree, his NCO gave the last branch a heavy swipe with his hand and quickly moved on. Our boring patrol leapt into life as man after man passed under the tree and was pounced upon by thousands of angry red ants. It took a 30-minute rest halt away from the tree with full deployment of security posts and small patrols for the worst affected to get their clothes off and get clear of those damn things. Most of us saw the funny side, although after that patrol, promises were extracted from those responsible never to do it again. But on this particular day, September 2nd, 1967, things had not been boring and were about to go downhill. One of our scouts, Marsh, had seen some sign and stopped the patrol. He placed 2 fingers on his left arm, indicating that he wanted the corporal to come up to his position. Maury Manton, as section commander, moved forward and crouched beside Marsh, and they watched for a few minutes. They decided that there definitely was a camp ahead. Maury gave the enemy signal with his hand to be sent back down the line. Then instead of doing what he had done dozens of times before, carrying on in single file in the suspicious area, he took 3 steps to the left, away from the known safe ground of the scouts' footprints. Maybe he was about to signal a sweep to be set up, as he was discussing doing some days ago. We will never know. A huge explosion rocked us all. I was back in the section behind Maury's, about 20 to 30 yards, and the blast knocked me off my feet. The thick bush absorbed most of the shrapnel and blast, but not for Marsh and Maury. Marsh was laid low, with bleeding wounds in his legs. Maury was laying 10 yards away from him in a smoking heap. He was moaning and moving his arms feebly. An engineer who was traveling with us on that patrol raced up the line, drew his bayonet, and began prodding his way from the line of march to where Maury was laying. "Hang on, mate. I'm coming to get you." "Stay where you are, all of you," yelled Maury. "Mines." We stayed put, terrified to even put our hands down to the ground. The engineer had reached Maury. He jabbed a curette into his neck. We all started to move forward using our bayonets to prod for mines. We stayed on the main line of route that had been established. We got up near where Maury was. Sentries went out, setting up a perimeter. The mined area was now clear to us. It was an approach to an old campsite. We could move quite freely in the thicker bushed areas. The boss quickly dispatched a bunch of us to find a clearer area as close as possible that we could make suitable for a chopper dust-off. As I went past the group of guys trying to help Maury, I heard him cursing his own stupidity, and also talking to his mother. I could see that there was nothing left of him below his waist. We attacked the small trees in a semi-clearing in a frenzy. In about 15 minutes, we had enough cleared to get a chopper overhead in a hover, but not clear enough to land. A chopper arrived and dropped a stretcher on a wire. It contained a cradle and bandages, rope, etc. The rest of the team had placed Maury on a tent half and were carrying him to our pickup site. A couple of the boys were picking up pieces of legs as best they could. Maury was unconscious as he was carried past me. I later learned that he had died on the ground. His body was winched up. The wire returned, and Marsh was winched up to go back to get his wounds attended to. After the chopper had gone, we did a very unhappy sweep of the camp and found more mines. We moved well away before setting up for a sleepless night. That night, the rains came. The bosses rightly read the mood of the men, and the rest of the patrol was called off. The next decent clearing that we came across, we dug in beside it, just in the tree line, and we called in the troop choppers. We stayed awake all night, hoping that Charlie would come back to his minefield and see what good work we had done. He would have received a warm reception. But nothing happened. One night in the rain, misery and frustration of having lost one of your own, and we were picked up and returned to Nui Dat. We were to have 2 more days in camp before our next patrol. I volunteered to help get Maury's gear ready for return to New Zealand. I packed up his personal things and made sure that the trunk of his items collected over many months did not include any items that would cause embarrassment to family or the Army authorities, like the M16 rifle that had been skillfully reduced to tiny parts far smaller than our normal field stripping, many pairs of our kangaroo hide combat boots, and other items of a personal nature. I was proud to perform this important service for him. We discovered later that New Zealand did not have a smooth operating procedure for returning the remains of our fallen from Vietnam. Decisions had not even been made whether to have burials in Malaysia at our base or home in New Zealand. Family requests and wily persuasion from our bosses resulted in a very kind offer from the USAF, whereby Maury was returned to New Zealand by American military aircraft. We are very grateful. 4 more of our mates in V Company were to be killed in action in Vietnam over the next few years. But Maury was our first, and my closest. Number 2. First Blood. It was dark, wet, and steaming hot. 2 busloads of V Company were to fly from Changi Base in Singapore in the middle of the night in an RNZAF C-130. We didn't own many C-130s. It's December 2011 as I write this story, and there is a very old and noisy C-130 that often flies over my home on Auckland's North Shore as it comes into land in Wanuapai. I strongly suspect it is the same plane that took us to Vietnam in April of 1967. We had been packed and ready to go all day. It was just on dusk as we rolled out of Terendok camp, near Malacca in central Malaysia. We were off to war at last. Surprisingly, a handful of bar girls stood outside the main gates and silently waved to us as we quietly turned left and headed south. I was quite moved, and then a particular girl named Susie Wong was in the group. And I later learned that a mother and daughter team from one of our favorite bars was also in the group. The daughter was a young beauty who had fallen from one of our platoon machine gunners. Gordon was about to distinguish himself on this tour of Vietnam and receive medalic recognition of his strength and bravery in his second tour a year and a half later. He came home to Malaysia and married the daughter and brought her to New Zealand. Today, as I write, they live in Waikato, surrounded by productive kids and beautiful grandchildren. Mrs. Gordon still cooks up a fantastic macaroni for us vets who call in from time to time. She is a happy, bubbly, living example of the Army's sensible relaxing of strict laws around the marriage and repatriation of local brides and our soldiers. Mrs. G returns home to Malaysia each year to see her family. She has done so for 43 years. But I digress. We dozed all night on the buses until, after some rather intense discussions and searching at Johor Bahru, we crossed the causeway into Singapore. The British and Malay Red Caps seemed unhappy with our expedition. They were looking to see that we had not brought any of the Bren guns with us, as we would have done if we could. And that idea was reinforced as a good one when one of our machine gunners reported that his M60 was still not reassembling correctly, and he was not sure enough of it to carry it into battle. While we were having breakfast in Changi camp in Singapore, waiting for our noon flight to Saigon, the boss came up to our two best scroungers, Staff Sergeant Joe Field and Sergeant Puku Parker. He gave them a huge roll of Malay and Singapore dollars and told them to find and buy at least one good condition M60 machine gun, plus any spare parts. They were back in camp later that morning with two. Our deficient one was left behind. The spare parts were soon needed, as we learned quickly that the M60 did not have the frontline stamina of the British Bren. I remember about halfway through the flight to Saigon, while trying to get comfortable on the diabolic lengthways webbing seats that the plane was rigged with, that I could not move my rifle. The SLR was lying between my legs and had frozen to the metal floor of the flight deck. I often thought of that flight years later, as I traveled business class from Auckland to New York on the latest 747. One blessing of going to war when you are 21 years old is that all of life's problems that are sitting up there in the wings, waiting to pounce on you and slow you down, become as naught. The whole Vietnam experience was about to change and mold me into a human being that could handle any of life's roadblocks, setbacks, and hardships. And most importantly, to laugh at their insignificance. My life was about to change forever. And for 5 of my mates on board that plane that day, life would forever end during the coming months. For some, this was their last C-130 ride. But these gloomy thoughts are only real years later. On the day, we marveled at the size of the Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon as we circled to land. It was the busiest airport in the world at that time, and it looked it. We were hustled off the aircraft and marched across the tarmac. Parked and moving, revving planes of every size and description deafened us. We saw our first sights of body bags, US, groups of soldiers of every type, double timing to and fro. Not needing any customs, formalities, passports, etc., we were simply moved into a tin shed and handed a full water bottle in exchange for an empty one off our belts, and one full magazine of live rounds for our rifles. I was horrified. What the hell was this? I knew we were going back by open truck to our new base at Nui Dat. About 5 to 6 hours through tiger country. Surely we need more than one magazine of ammo. I'd been used to carrying 6 mags plus one loaded on my rifle. Nope. That's all we were getting. More was waiting at Nui Dat. Yeah, we have to get there first, I thought. Maybe it was probably because our main small arms requirement was for 7.62mm SLR ammo, and only us and the Aussies used that. Anyway, on to open trucks we went. It's 45 years ago, but I can remember every village, every corner, every hillock and tree clump between Than Son Nuet Air Base and Nui Dat. The road had been pacified and was heavily patrolled by American patrols and convoys, but they had also been ambushed on it many times. In fact, our first New Zealand fatality was on this road in the previous year. One of our gunners from 161 Battery was ambushed in his Jeep. So we arrived safely at the red clay, rubber trees, and mud road paradise of Nui Dat, home of the 1st Australian Task Force, with one of the Aussie battalions now designated Anzac as our rifle company joined it. My platoon was quickly shown its new lines, a stretch of rubber trees and open ground to the front that was to be our sector. Some bunkers were completed, but not enough for 3 platoons plus HQ section. The left-hand bunkers of my platoon butted up against those of 11 platoon, 6 RAR, who a few months earlier had won a massive firefight with NVA and Viet Cong a short distance from our wire, called the Battle of Long Tan. They had lost 18 men from their 30-man platoon, and were looking forward to going home in a couple of months. They were replaced by 2 RAR. Both units were terrific guys, and we got on well with them on both sides of the wire. In fact, they had a resident front-end loader that had a narrow shovel which was ideal for digging crawls and walking trenches. Our new platoon lines needed many of these, between bunkers, and especially from our living bunkers out to the sentry bunkers on the wire. Our boss Ray was very busy getting our settling in organized, so I borrowed his wrist armlet, showing his 2 lieutenants pips and his Colt Auto 45 sidearm belt and weapon, left my rifle in our bunker, and strolled over to the Oz lines. "Hey, driver!" I yelled with authority to the sweating driver of the FE loader. "Follow me to the Kiwi lines and dig a few trenches for them, will you?" "Yes, sir," he said. He spun the loader around and, like a nodding and lurching dinosaur, followed me slowly back to our lines. The guys saw me coming, put down their muddy shovels, and started with the standing order of the day. "Over here, sir," they would yell to me. I would direct my compliant Aussie to the required trench area, and away we went. By plying the driver and his sidekick with many Kiwi beers that evening, we had his services of the following day as well. The hardest parts of all our trenches were done. All we had to do was manually link them up and reinforce them where they met up with the bunkers. The boss was most impressed with my leadership skills and lying ability. and muttered something about capital charges for imitating a commissioned officer while on active service, and then seeing that I would get onto a regular officer selection course as soon as our tour was over. He repeated this when he discovered in the coming months that I was the only one in his platoon that could speak or read a little French and play chess. But as fate had a way of working out, a career officer I was not meant to be. By the first weekend, excitement was building. We were going to go out on our first fighting patrol. It was to be a 4-day, 3-night rectangular path patrol that would take us just out of the TAOR, or Tactical Area of Responsibility, areas and into a free fire area. These areas were designated as unpacified and could contain elements of enemy activity. But key to the designation was that there was no legitimate civilian activity in the zone. Any movement or activity was designated as enemy and, as such, could be fired upon. This being our first operation, we were encouraged to try out all available field rations in camp before we packed. This would enable us to select to carry only those items that we liked. The choices were surprisingly good. We had a choice of U.S. Rat Packs, canned goodies like ham and lima beans, spaghetti and meatballs, chili, mince, and even a small loaf of canned bread and cake. Also on offer were British issue packs from Malaysia, mainly dehydrated meals. These were no good in dry season, when the only water in the bush was what we carried from our belts, and that was needed for drinking. But also included in this Brit pack was a small, silver can of ham and egg omelet. I declared this to be my favorite and packed 6 of them into my pack, at the expense of other items. We had our briefing, packed rations and ammo, saddled up, and headed out through the wire for the first time. The weather was hot and dry, and even at our slow, careful patrol pace, we had cleared the heavy bush rubber mixed growth by midday, and were getting into more rolling country, with some sparse cleared areas. Heat shimmers and occasional dust made clear vision difficult, but we had great faith in our lead scouts. During the middle of the second afternoon, we were stopping for a drink every hour and starting to ration ourselves as the streams and rivers showing up on the map were all coming up dry. I was traveling in the platoon HQ section behind our radio operator, Ghoul, and decided that I was still a bit hungry, not having had much to eat at the lunch stop. I had to carry a message to each of our quickly posted sentries. These groups of 2 men were set in a rough circle around the main body of the patrol when we stopped for any length of time longer than the hourly rest break of 3 to 4 minutes. So while we simply went to ground and rested, each facing outwards in our order of march, I quickly and soundlessly whipped out a can of ham and egg omelet and spooned down a couple of mouthfuls of the delicious mixture. Earlier than I anticipated, the click-click tongue signal of "move on" came down the line, and I saddled up my pack and put the half-eaten can in a side pocket of my jungle green trousers. Later, I thought. We had gone ahead a few dozen yards when 2 rifle shots rang out, then a flurry of several more. We dived to the ground, facing outwards, looking for any cover. "Contact front!" came the cry. This meant that our scouts and the lead section had fired on, or had been fired on by, an enemy element. Holy shit! It's our first contact. We all try to crawl forward to get closer to the action, but cover was sparse. "Stay where you are!" A yell from somewhere. More firing up front. Some yells. Then silence. One of the guys in one section comes running down our line to the boss, who is on one knee with the radio in hand, telling Nui database that we are an enemy contact and to stand by for further info. "3 of them. We got 3 of them, boss. But 2 have taken off over the hill on the right. 1 is dead." "Anyone hurt?" yells the boss. "No. All okay." "Right. Stand fast. 2 section," he yells. No need for patrol silence now. "Go left, flanking and form a perimeter with 1 section. Fast." The 7 men in 2 sections scurry to the front and fan out. Things settle down. We are all itching to get in on the action, but know our jobs are to hold our positions and cover our immediate fronts. Who knows how many more of them are out there, especially as 2 were seen running away. They might be getting reinforcements and getting ready to attack our flank at any moment. Excitement buzzes all around. Weapons are gripped in sweaty vice-like hands. All eyes on the open ground and tree line 30 yards away. Just when I'm starting to think that we don't have much cover here, and maybe we should be digging our usual shell scrapes, the section commander from the front section runs to the boss, kneels down and says, "We've done a sweep. No sign of the 2 that got away, but we must have wounded 1. There's a blood trail." "Right. Follow it for 200 yards only. Take the whole section. Go slowly. Cover each other each step." "Right, boss." He runs back up front. Meanwhile, Ghoul reports that HQ has advised that they want us to return any prisoners and bodies to them ASAP. This being our first contact, and one that was so close to the large base of Nui Dat, they wanted to get the intelligent reports done firsthand, and fast. "Wilson, tell Mitty to bring the dead VC back from chopper pickup." For these first few weeks of patrolling, headquarters sent choppers to our contact sites for body or captive pickup. As the weeks went on, this practice was dropped, presumably because the numbers of our kills became too large. We soon adopted the practice of burying our enemy dead where they lay after each action. I ran, crouching, up to the front of the patrol. 2 of the guys were preparing to lift a body tied to a pole onto their shoulders for carrying back. As they came past me, I looked in horror to see that one entire shoulder and arm was missing, and the stomach was torn open by what must have been a tracer rifle round. Smoke from burning flesh was still drifting from the gaping wound, along with steaming, bleeding entrails. One arm and both legs were tied to the pole, but in the absence of the other arm, the guys had tied the long, black hair to the pole to balance the load. Yes, long black hair. It was a woman, and 2 7.62mm SLR rounds, one a tracer, had made a complete mess of her body. I stared at my first battlefield wounds. None of the dozens of similar sights to come in the next few months had this effect on me. The ham and egg omelet came straight up, out of my mouth and all over the ground in my boots. The body was carried back to the designated landing zone for the chopper. We regrouped and carried on with the patrol. The rest of the next 2 days are a blur. We didn't talk about the contact. We didn't meet any other enemy. Our firing probably scared off any enemy presence for miles around. We seemed to be back at camp sooner than expected. It slowly came out that our lead section had surprised a small group of itinerant civilians, although intelligence called them VC collaborators, gathering wood and materials. They were unarmed. No blame was mentioned. A report in a New Zealand paper that I saw years later, dated that week in 1967, carried the headline, "Kiwis Get First Kill in Vietnam." It called the action a firefight between us and elements of a local VC battalion, D445, who we did meet up with many times later. We never talked about it. A close mate, to this day of mine, was one of the 3 riflemen who fired on the group. We are well over the unarmed woman aspect of the action. At the time, he was only worried about getting into trouble with the boss because he thought he missed with his first shot. I learned that we were not the big, tough jungle fighters that we thought we were. We quietly felt bad about the whole incident, but we knew it came with the territory. We would have far more honorable actions against a well-armed and determined enemy to come, and we proved ourselves. We also had no qualms about returning fire on a woman in this violent war against guerrillas, who were a match for our jungle craft. I never ate, or took into the field again a can of ham and egg omelet, and I will never use, nor approve of, the current casual use of the term gutted in conversations. Number 3. Grown men do cry, and the green, green grass of home. But then, maybe the fact that we did cry shows that in some ways, despite the hard-favored rage of the bard's English soldier, we were really lonely young men on the cusp of manhood, who happened to have chosen a profession that required an exterior image different to whatever was happening inside our young heads. The first of my 2 examples of this happened on my first night at Burnham Camp, outside Christchurch. I had been sent there from Waiouru, in the center of the North Island, after completing my basic infantry training. Burnham was home to the depot of the 1st Battalion, Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. It was here that the Army took new recruits who had successfully passed the basic tests of being a soldier, and turned him into a skilled infantry fighter, capable of living off the land in open and jungle terrains anywhere in the world. During this specialized corps training, one potential area of focus was the border war of Borneo, where our battalion was already serving as part of the British Commonwealth response to Indonesia's invasion and aggression to the newly formed Malaysia. The other scenario that we trained for was more open warfare in such terrains as southern Thailand, an area still plagued by terrorists. I don't remember Vietnam being mentioned at this time, though I'm sure that it was on the minds of our instructors. As I was about to find out, our jungle skills and drills worked just as well in the New Zealand bush, Malay jungle or Vietnamese paddy, jungle, village, and roadways. As long as we became experts at all things infantry, we would be fine. I was soon in my new and very unfamiliar bed and surroundings in Burnham Camp. What the hell am I doing here? I thought. How had I come to be in this godforsaken place? Lying in my new bed that first night, I thought that a review of my Army career so far would help distract me. I had left my cushy life in Wellington 4 months ago and spent a sunny day on the train from my hometown to the main army camp in New Zealand, Waiouru. I was excited, confident and full of visions of adventure and maybe even glory. I can remember sitting on the right-hand side of the rattling old 1940s carriage as we wound through the Plimerton's hills and came out onto the narrow strip of line above the Ramadi Strait. Up the steep hill to my right were glistening slides of shingle, blooming bushes of yellow gorse, and patches of grass in small, steep valleys. In the bottom of one of these valleys, my eye caught something move. I focused on it. It was a rabbit, about 300 yards up the hill. I alone in the world could see it. My superior eyesight and natural hunting skills had pinpointed him. I could have shot him from the moving train even at that range and sharp uphill angle, I thought. Man, this army is getting one hell of a sharp recruit. Bring it on. I reveled in my choice of lifestyle change. As this change became profound over the next 3 months of basic training, I never once lost this enthusiasm for my new career. Ahead of me were sleeping quarters that were so cold, the wet boots at the end of my bed froze at night. Walking was a mode of transport that filed away in the mind under the heading of other, later. As a rookie grunt, I had to double time or jog everywhere at all times within the camp. My new army boots were not issued until day 3 of my induction, and my civilian shoes peeled off my feet along with the beer-induced layers of flab from the rest of my body. For some inexplicable reason, I was joining a national service intake to do my basic training for the regular force that I had signed on for. I'd been waiting 18 months from signing up in 1965, and when I was offered this chance to start my new life, I took it. I discovered that the basics were no different from a regular force basic course, except that I was a bit of a geek, a standout as the only one in our 3 platoons of reluctant national service guys who really wanted to be there. This became obvious in my practice of doing extra map reading SWAT or weapons manual reading at night instead of socializing in the mess. On weekends, during off-duty times, I would go for a 5-mile run around the frozen waste of Waiouru. It was at Waiouru that I had the first of a series of good luck appointments and NCOs placed over me in my career. A platoon sergeant was a mild-mannered and immaculately dressed soldier. Sergeant Mowat had the rare skill of yelling softly on a parade ground, being heard loud and clear with wit, sarcasm, and at most times, compassion. His was the job of changing us from civilian slobs into trained infantry soldiers who were capable of going on to any corps of the army, should the need arrive. I don't remember being treated any differently because I was a regular recruit, but I was very much aware that my attitude to the daily grind was different and more upbeat than my new mates. One unforgettable parade ground drill session sticks out in my mind. We had to parade around in our dress number 1s. We were a motley-looking lot, and he told us so in his soft, powerful way. He then told us about pride in our personal appearance, what it did for our fellow soldiers, how our personal example lifted the performance of ourselves and of those around us. This was not sinful pride. It was a soldierly pride. Keep it as a very private attribute, he said. Don't talk about it. Don't be vain about it. But make it the cornerstone of everything you do when you present yourselves in public, in the bush, or on parade. I can't recreate the passion with which he drilled us in this philosophy, but I have never forgotten his lessons, backed up with his personal example every day. Sergeant Muwat is one of those men I would like to meet today, to say thanks. 3 outstanding pieces of training stand out in my mind. He and a drill instructor taught me how to defend myself against a man attacking me with a bayonet on a rifle, and flip him over in such a way that I had the rifle and bayonet to the attacker's throat while he lay on his back. Defense against a man armed with just a knife, underarm or overarm came next, and is still remembered by me to this day. He showed us, and then drilled us, time and time again, how to debus, fully laden with pack and rifle from an RL Bedford truck traveling at speed. We worked up from 5 miles an hour to a top speed of 50 miles an hour. This enabled our platoon to disperse onto 2 sides of a road, float from the back of the truck, land on our feet, and move into defensive positions. It was an exciting and never used trick. A drill from World War II, but we loved it. How powerful we felt. The sergeant was the first of many inspiring leaders to come. A short week at home in Lower Hutt, a cold trip in the overnight ferry to Lyttelton, a day's wait in a windy army office in Christchurch, and I was finally on my way back by truck to Burnham, the home of the depot of 1st Battalion. Luckily, I had with me my universal and timeless army greatcoat. It helped me through the long day of waiting for a ride out. This was the battalion that was posted to Malaysia since the 1950s to meet our commitments in Southeast Asia. Current operations were on the border between Malaysia and Indonesia and Borneo, repelling Indonesia's aggression and attempted invasion of the new state. We were training to join them. I was to join a platform of recruits to be sent to Malaysia for this replacement role as soon as we had mastered the skills of our craft as riflemen. But back to that first night. The duty corporal signed me in the only lit building in the entire camp. It was 10:30 p.m., and the place was silent and deserted. "I'll take you to your barrack where you'll be living. Your training platoon sergeant is Sergeant Bob Hewlett. You'll meet him in the morning. Get some sleep tonight. Don't unpack. You'll wake the others. They've had a big day. You have some extra time in the morning to get your gears organized." A very friendly and reassuring set of welcome instructions. I'd become accustomed to being a loner in the Army due to the difference of my timing and recruitment from day one. I walked quietly down the length of the barrack room. I counted 12 beds on each side of the old World War II building. My empty bed was at the end of the right-hand row. All was quiet except for the usual grunts, soft snores, and rustling that you get in a room full of young, sleeping men. I quickly stripped off, found my wardrobe next to the bed, and stowed all my gear in it, hopped into bed in my underpants, and lay back wondering if or when sleep would come. 3 or 4 minutes passed and I was settling in. Something caught my ear. A new noise about halfway down the row of beds, across the aisle from me. It was a snuffling noise that I soon recognized as crying. I had heard it on the first night in the barracks in Waharu, evidently reasonably common in the first week of basic training. But this was the next step up. We had passed the basics, and were here now, voluntarily, to hone our soldiery skills and graduate as battle-ready infantry soldiers. I felt embarrassed for the soldier, whoever he was. Maybe he's had a family death or something. No one said anything or did anything. The crying went on for some time, and I found myself lying back, thinking strange thoughts. I'm a long way from all that I grew up with, all that I knew I was good at. Every hour of every day yesterday and tomorrow was filled with new, difficult, testing, and sometimes impossible tasks. Could I cope? What the hell was I doing here, in a bedroom with 23 complete strangers? I started to wonder what my brother and sister were doing tonight. Mom and dad, schoolmates, and of course, girlfriends. I came out of my intense thoughts. My new friend-to-be was still crying, and now it sounded like loneliness. A little like despair. It was quite frightening. What happens in this place that they have sent me to, where a grown man of 20 years of age cries himself to sleep in the dark, surrounded by friends who ignore him? I suppose I'll find out tomorrow, as I better get some sleep. I turn over, pull up the rough blanket. Silence. Soft crying again. A voice from directly across from the foot of my bed, loud and angry. For fuck's sake, Shirley, if you don't shut that fucking sniveling, I'm gonna come down there and do it for you. Silence. No more crying. And don't you start, new boy, or I'll shoot you out too. I thought, I've found the pack leader anyway, and he doesn't like me already. Oh well, tomorrow's going to be interesting. First light, stirring in the ranks. The pack leader is a scruffy-looking bloke with a tattoo on his arm of what appears to be Andy Capp. The caption on it says, "Geez, am I seedy?" He speaks to me. The bloke's got an Australian accent. What the hell's he doing here? I notice his name tape on the front of his helmet on his wardrobe. Brian Ellis. Nice to see someone else with a poofter name, I say with a grin, pointing at his helmet. He glares. What do you mean, poofter? You fucking faggot. I'll give you poofter. He glares at me, preparing to come over and sort me out. Time to end this intellectual conversation. I'm Brian Wilson. Same name, see? My schoolmates sometimes call it a poofter name. I was always the only Brian around. Yeah, he says with a grin. Me too. Come on, I'll show you where the bathrooms and breakfast are. I was in. The bloke became one of my closest mates for the rest of his life. We served together in Vietnam, debauched ourselves in bars all over Asia. We spent a day and a half stuck in a shell hole with a Yank, under fire and scared shitless. He went AWOL in 1969 to attend my wedding, and I went to Adelaide in 1977 to meet his family, and the Yank. He was one of my many extremely colorful soldiers I met. He was borderline soldier material at all stages of our training and service. He was always on a charge and serving fatigues, or cell time, for crimes large and small. I never got placed on a charge in New Zealand, Malaysia, or Vietnam. It used to drive him nuts. We were chalk and cheese, and inseparable. My Aussie mate was by my side in adventures for years after we left the army. Even years later, when I was a senior corporate manager at IBM, and he was wharfie on Wellington's Wharf, We would meet for a few beers several times a week. He became a brother to me. He looked like a sad sack as a soldier. But one day in Vietnam, in very dicey circumstances, he carried a man in his pack and rifle along with his own gear all day out of water until we could get the injured guy to an APC for help. Ozzy was a soldier when it mattered. Although his arriving drunk at IBM cocktail function at a Wellington hotel in the 1970s didn't enhance my career any. Things were just manageable until he jumped up onto a table, lowered his trousers, bent over and yelled, "How do you like this one, you wankers?" Stunned, silence amongst the gentlemen and ladies as we all stared and wondered at the huge, colored rat disappearing up Ozzy's backside. It wasn't the only time I saw old Roger the Rat, but it was the time that made the biggest impression. So, somehow Ozzy and I made it through corpse training. My last memory of Sergeant Hewlett is at a graduation celebration with a large keg of beer on the back of a ute in a riverbed somewhere, sitting around the fire all night with Sergeant Bob leading the way with songs and stories. He was a terrific trainer. Ozzy proudly showed me his country when our C-130 Hercules stopped at Alice Springs, 12 hours into our flight to Singapore. Then it was Singapore, Malaysia, and on to Vietnam together, as you will read about it elsewhere in these pages. But I never saw Ozzy cry until our last day in Vietnam. We completed our last night's patrol, packed our gear, and were sitting around on the horseshoe waiting for the choppers to come get us. We were going home. The Yanks had been conducting a hearts and minds exercise in our province for months. They would drop pamphlets in the bush and fly their little Cessna around with a huge loudspeaker mounted on the doorway. They would play messages that exhorted the VC to give themselves up to their local forces. We didn't think much of the program, but here we are on the last day in country, and the bloody Cessna appears overhead and begins circling us. From the speaker we hear the booming voice of Tom Jones singing, "The green, green grass of home." From every bunker, from every trench, and all over the horseshoe came yells and cheers of appreciation. And when I looked around, tears everywhere. Even Ozzy in the bunker next to me had tears running down his face. I'd love to know who thought of and organized that wonderful gesture for V Company. It was one of the most memorable incidents of the war for me. To this day, it's the theme song for our company, and it's the only song I ever sung on a karaoke stage. It will play at my funeral, and if you're lucky enough to be there, look around. If you see any survivors of V Company, they will be crying once again. Old adages jump all over my mind. Tried and true is a phrase that is law and lore in the profession of infantry soldiering. So why was Maury waxing lyrical to any of us who would listen the other night in a mess over a few beers? He was worrying about our habit of infiltrating a VC camp in the same single file that we traveled in while on patrol that found the camp. probably scared off any Charlie that might have been there, no matter how quiet we were in the approach," he had said, nodding his large head wisely. He may have been correct. We often found signs of very recent occupations. Fires not put out properly, food prepared but not finished, gear left scattered that Charlie would normally have taken. We learned a lot about how Charlie lived using this method. We argued. Yeah, but maybe we're letting them get away more often than he should. Scouts had leg wounds. He was also winched up and taken off on the dust-off chopper. This is before the rain started. It was just after midday, and our oldest and most experienced NCO had stepped on a landmine. What I was really upset about was my own attitude and thoughts. I couldn't get it out of my head that it could have been me. No, it was more than that. I was not sorry for poor old Maury. I was leaping for joy, at least internally, that it wasn't me. It bothers me to this day that this was my overriding emotion as we flew back to safety. Selfish, self-centered, thanking the gods of war that it was not me who died. So much for honoring the fallen. Clichés galore bombard me, Maury had said, glaring at his dissenters. So here's a better plan that I've been thinking about, he said. How about when the Clee, his lead scout, spots the first signs of a camp, we bring up the section in the left or right flanking line so that we're ready for a camp-wide sweep when the contact is made, instead of a one-on-one fight with their tail-end Charlie as the rest of them bug out. Huh? What do you say? Yup, we said. Could be something in that. Knowing that changing an ingrained battle drill after discussion with just a few of us over a beer was mostly unlikely. 3 days later, we were back in the long green. The platoon stretched out in single file, 4 sections long. The only excitement so far had been a turn in the patrol that had me pause and watch in suspicion as the man in front of me suddenly veered hard, 45 degrees left. When I got to his turn point, I could see that he already turned 45 degrees right and was continuing in the same direction as our original line of march. I followed him. He then turned 45 degrees again, first to the right, then after about 6 to 7 paces, left again. We were back on the same line of march. And so was the patrol behind me. We were all achieving a square loop around a particular tree that now became obvious to me. I saw a thick brown-green vine that wound around the trunk of this tall tree. My eyes followed it upwards. It got thicker and thicker, and then started to writhe and move. The scouts in Maury's section in the patrol had cleverly moved our entire line of march smoothly and silently around the largest fucking python I had seen up until that point in my travels in Southeast Asia. It was a detour we all enjoyed and appreciated. This was the first heavy downpours of the new wet season had just set in. I was drenched and cold and miserable. I leaned out of the side door of the chopper and watched the trees flash past the runners of the Huey. We were at treetop level and hightailing it back to Nui Dat. Why was I miserable? My mate, my mentor, my friend, my teacher was dead. Maury Manton was our first killed in action. It was a mine on the outskirts of a VC camp. We had loaded his body, what was left of it, into a lowered stretcher cradle and added the pieces of legs and guts that we could find. Marsh, one of our